Welcome. I'd like to go through the studies that Hattie used in his feedback influence. This is the basis of my education department's 10 high-impact teaching strategies, of which feedback is one, and the education department based his notions of high impact on these effect sizes. Hattie quotes 0.73. Teachers really need to know how that number is calculated because it's the basis of educational policy these days. And I think teachers should really understand that. I've got a fuller discussion of the number in that effect size page on the right. In addition, Hattie continues to use an effect size of 0.4 as his hinge point, and he equates that with a year's growth. So anything above 0.4 is considered to be in the zone of desired effects. Now, Hattie used about 20 meta-analysis that he references in his appendix, and I've copied them here. So what he did was he derived an average effect size from each study and then averaged all of these averages to get his 0.73. It's interesting to note also that this statistic, the common language effect size, is a probability statistic, and it can only be between 0 and 100%, and many peer reviews have picked up that all of these are wrong. For example, he's got the Stanley study giving a probability of 203%, which is impossible. It took him a while, but he finally admitted they were wrong, and he's removed them from his book. In addition, he's got a brief description of the sort of feedback and variables that Hattie used. Now, what this study will show, or what this overview will show, that one of the original criticisms of this meta-analysis technique that Hattie uses was that they combined apples with oranges. And Hattie's well aware of that, and in the introduction to his book he says a common criticism of meta-analysis is that it combines apples with oranges, and such combining of many seemingly disparate studies is fraught with difficulties. It is the case, however, that in the study of fruit nothing else is sensible. So that's his defence, not a particularly good defence, I don't think. And it's ironic that one of the meta-analysis that Hattie used, Rummel and Feinberg, conclude their paper by saying it is argued that by including studies that claim to examine this theory but are in reality not adequately operationalising the theoretical positions, this only serves to obscure the true nature of the area. So that's where I'm coming from. I think the way that Hattie combines his studies really obscures what's going on. I'm not against feedback per se, but what I'm against is the way in which he uses effect sizes and the way that he averages them to come up with some way of categorising that some educational influence are high impact, some are low, some are good, some are bad, some work, some don't. I think they're the ideas that need to be challenged. There are many peer reviews that do challenge Hattie's work. For example, Professor Terry Ridgely, in typical English humorous style, says that his method is based on stirring together hundreds of meta-analysis, reporting on many thousands of pieces of research to measure the effectiveness of interventions. This is like claiming that a hammer is the best way to crack a nut, but without distinguishing between coconuts and peanuts, or saying whether the experiment used a sledgehammer or the inflatable plastic one you won at the fair. So I think you'll see that Terry Ridgely's description is pretty apt. One of the first peer reviews of the studies in feedback was Ruiz, Primo and Lee. They looked at roughly 9,000 studies and found that only about 131 of them were considered appropriate. And the reason that they found that was they were able to classify each of the studies, and they found that each of the studies differed the apples and oranges problem in so many areas. For example, whether it was the teacher that gave the feedback, the kids' friends, self-feedback or computer-based, and many, many other differences in each of the studies. So they then conclude, clearly the range of feedback definitions is wide, and they ask, how is it possible to argue for feedback effects without considering the nuances and the differences amongst the studies? I think that's a fair enough question. Many other scholars have found the same thing. In 2017, Nielsen and Klitmoller said the same thing, that the studies that Hattie used are disparate, and combining them together is sort of meaningless. They also go into another layer of analysis, and they then look at the studies in terms of how many students were part of each studies, and they found that 5 of the studies, they call it, had the heaviest number of students, which means that the most number of students that participated in that study. So they look at those 5 studies, and then they go into detail and produce a table. And the quality areas they look at is the validity of the study. What was the study measuring feedback in a way that's consistent with Hattie's definition of feedback? Was the data transparent? In other words, could you find the data and then check it? And then did they use control groups, which is a very important operational procedure that can affect and does affect the result. They then found that out of those 5 studies that were the heaviest, the Kluger and Denisi study in 1996 was perhaps the best study, which they agreed with Hattie. Hattie mentions that this appears to be the best study in his book. But then they asked the obvious question that if that's so, if we look at the Kluger and Denisi, they only report an effect size of 0.38. Which is way less than the 0.73 that Hattie averages. And in addition, that 0.38 is below Hattie's hinge point of 0.4, which Hattie never talks about. So the combining of these disparate studies can lead you to very different conclusions. They also find that Kluger and Denisi study, around 30% of the studies got a negative effect size, which means that the feedback caused a decrease in the student achievement. And that they critical of Hattie in that Hattie often says that almost everything works. And later in Visible Learning, he actually makes a very disparaging claim that in the classroom, because almost anything works, all you need is a pulse. So they challenged that assumption of Hattie's. Professor Dylan William also confirms the same sorts of things. I've got a video from Professor William where he goes through feedback, and he talks about the disparity and the differences in the definitions of feedback. And then he's had a long-running battle with Hattie, and he says once again results are meaningless when you combine or when you compare studies in such a matter. Another long person in opposition to Hattie is Professor Robert Slavin from the USA. He's made a number of writings. In his writing, John Hattie is Wrong, he gives some other examples of the studies. He looks at the Rummel and Feinberg, which we'll look at in a minute, and he shows that the Rummel and Feinberg is not a study on feedback as used in the classroom. Rather, it's a study looking at intrinsic motivation, and the theory being that if you reward intrinsic motivation, then performance can decrease. So he also mentions that they code the study such that a positive effect size actually in their context means a negative effect size in Hattie's, and Hattie doesn't adjust. So Hattie reports positive 0.6, but it's actually negative 0.6. So I checked the Rummel and Feinberg study, and Professor Slavin, I think, is correct. So it's a meta-analysis, so it combines a whole range of different studies like these. So it's looking at intrinsically motivating tasks. Often they used puzzles with kids, and the reward was perhaps chocolates or money. And the effect sizes reported, if they're positive, that means a decrease in performance. The other thing that you'll all notice is that they include preschool children, college-age students, and Hattie has been criticised because a lot of the studies that he uses aren't normal primary school or high school studies. So there's quite a few professors that have asked him to remove those studies so that he gets an accurate representation of schooling age. Hattie hasn't done that so far. It's quite interesting that given these chocolates as a reward system, the regulatory body in my jurisdiction, the Victorian Institute of Teaching, publish dismissal proceedings, and one poor teacher, one of the charges against him was inappropriate gift buying. The Institute described this as bribery. So it's interesting that teachers that give out these sorts of rewards can be charged with misconduct. More reviewers say the same sorts of things. Schulmeister and Lovelich in 2014 look at one of the Stanley study that Hattie used. And that particular study, if we go back to Hattie's appendix, reports the highest effect size in his bunch of feedback studies, 2.87, which is quite large. He reports they use music as reinforcement. So when you look into the study, you'll find a lot more detail, as the review here suggests. They show that the study is actually about using music to change behaviour, not to improve achievement. So that's another problem. Hattie often includes studies that don't measure achievement. In the introduction to his book, he said it's all about achievement, but there are many examples when it's not. For example, there's one of the studies that this meta-analysis used was on old age people who had depression, and they were measuring in some sort of fashion the amount of complaints that patients would have. They also looked at assembly line production having background music and the effect on the behaviour or the attention of the workers. So that goes to show you that these studies are quite disparate. Lastly, this particular page in my blog goes through a whole lot of other factors. David Dido, an English writer, wrote a little blog on feedback as well. It's sort of concluding similar to what I'm saying, and he includes the PISA results from a few years ago, and he shows that in the PISA analysis, the index of perceived feedback is negatively rated. So what that all goes to show is that feedback is quite a complex complex notion, and by combining studies in the way that Hattie does, I don't think it really clarifies the area. And then to call feedback a high impact teaching strategy, I think is quite misleading. Thank you.